Coordinator. This is Pedro Marques, the Director of the Big Hole Watershed Committee. And when I was starting to plan out the speaker series for the summer, I wanted to find folks who had already done some research and to give us some information on what their studies have found already. So we've had the DNRC come in, tell us what they found in the groundwater study. We just had Michael Schwartz with the National Genomics Wildlife and Conservation Genomics Center show us where the bull trout are and how they track them up here in the Lolo Watershed. But now I kind of wanted to present more information about what another watershed is doing, given some of the same limiting factors that we have. Our bull trout are not doing well in our population size and range, and we are consistently having the lower 3 miles of Lolo Creek dewatered every year. So we're starting to see the effects of minimal water in this valley, and the Big Hole has also already experienced that. One of the differences between the two nonprofits, though, is our watershed group was started with just residents of the watershed, people who lived on the river but not necessarily owned a lot of land, whereas the Big Hole Watershed Committee was formed by a bunch of ranchers who were concerned about losing their water rights due to the limiting factors that they were seeing. So that's one of the, that's kind of the difference between the two of us. But without further ado, Pedro Marques, with an S, not a Z.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody. So I'm just psyched to be here, and it's great to get the invite from Heather. We go back kind of a ways in this field. I was a contractor for watershed consulting for many years out of Missoula. Actually bumped into the Lolo Watershed group a couple times. But the Big Hole, I've got a map of it here. We're in southwest Montana. It's one of those blue ribbon trout fisheries that people flock to from all over. In 1988, the Big Hole at Wisdom went dry for 32 days. In a year much like this one, a water year much like this one. This year, we're actually at the same low precip levels and the same kind of cataclysmic fire season and drought. The Big Hole has not gone dry this year anywhere. We hope it doesn't. It would kind of be a miracle. So what's the difference, right? The difference is, to us, it's been collaborative conservation, and it's been the social infrastructure that was built with the formation of the Watershed Committee. That was, I'll talk about a lot of the types of work that we do and how it's integrated into the needs of the community, but at the end of the day, there's nothing replaces, in my mind, creating the space for a group of stakeholders with different interests to come together and talk to each other about issues that affect the watershed and also learn from experts. And it sounds like you guys are well on the way kind of in that direction to kind of create that. And this is really what it looks like. So a couple things prompted the Watershed Committee to form. The state was looking at the Big Hole River, and they were potentially going to list it as a chronically dewatered stream. And then we also had the Arctic grayling. So that's a trout species, the only fluvial population of Arctic grayling in the lower 48 is in the Big Hole. There are populations in lakes, but there's only one that's still living in the river system. That species was also threatened to get listed on the Endangered Species Act. Some people, definitely when I was kind of coming up in school and in my grad program, I would think, oh yeah, that's a good thing, right? The Endangered Species Act, we're gonna protect these fish, so yeah, let's put them on the list. From the perspective of the ranchers, it's actually the opposite. If you get a listing and a fish listed in your watershed, if you take water to irrigate your fields, that could be considered a take against the viability of that fish. So ranchers could actually be liable for harming an endangered species at that point. That's like the worst thing that a rancher in southwest Montana could imagine, right? Is the federal government coming in and having a say in how they manage their land, how much water they can and can't take. It's very much, so it really, the threat of litigation and the threat of these listings really kind of forced a lot of conversations to happen. And they were really hard conversations. I was not around when those conversations was happening. You know, it was things like, how are we going to manage our water together? Because if we don't do it together, someone's going to come in and do it for us, right? And that's a big deal. That's a real threat, and I think you're probably, with the bull trout, those same dynamics are at play because you're activating the same federal processes, right? So some of the first things that they did, so first the decision was made, okay, we've got to get together, we've got to figure out how to collectively manage water. So first things first is we created the state's first voluntary drought management plan. We got support from, there were state senators involved. There was actually, Conrad Burns was actually a huge supporter of the formation of the committee at first. He was even actually able to get appropriations in Congress for the creation of the watershed group and appropriations to put money towards the conservation work that followed. Those days were over, but there's some indication that earmarks are actually kind of okay now, and some people are starting to think again about earmarks. So I won't kind of not get too far into the weeds, but these are like, you know, our representatives in Washington, D.C. can put in very specific targeted projects into budget bills to get money for their constituents. It used to be called, like, you know, pork, or like government overspending, and it could be a source for corruption and things like that, but it also, that type of work also created our organization and gave us like the funding base to actually do what needed to be done in the watershed. Some of the first things we did is we really needed to understand the dynamics of the water in the basin. One of the really key features of the Big Hole is that it is, this part of the Big Hole River right here is really high elevation, very snowy, it's very cold. There's a lot of actually climatically limiting factors to doing agriculture up there. Your growing season's really short, so you only get one cutting of hay up there in general. Because of all of the climatic constraints, putting pivots and other types of irrigation infrastructure up there doesn't make a lot of sense. Super expensive, a lot of maintenance costs, a lot of headaches. So the entire upper Big Hole is flood irrigated. This is considered old school. It's inefficient, right? There were all these knocks against flood irrigation. One of the first things we did is hired engineers, the DNRC, and other folks came and did a lot of studying to understand the water balance in the river. And what we came to realize is actually the only way a rancher down in Glen has water in August is because these guys are flooding in May. Why is that? They're putting all the water that's coming down, they're spreading it out on the land, it's soaking into the soil, and it actually takes 4 to 5 months for all of that water to percolate slowly, move through the groundwater. It pops up in places and it generates springs, but really, and then it comes back to the Big Hole. It does a U-turn and it goes through a tight little canyon, and then it comes back out kind of into the Glen Valley along I-15 there. Getting that science and understanding that science of where the water goes was really critical. So then we really understood first that flood irrigation is actually beneficial. Those return flows that come back, it's inefficient, right? You're not using all of the water. There's a lot of, the upper Big Hole, if you've ever been there in June, it's like a moving lake, basically. There's so much water out on that floodplain that it's just, water is just moving all over. Terribly inefficient, you could say. But that return flow is critical. If everybody up in the upper river had been pivot irrigating, there wouldn't be water in the Big Hole right now. Like, absolutely not. And some of the studies that we did kind of really lined that out and showed people. So that kind of comes back to another driving force for the Big Hole's formation, which was, let's not figure out how to do a watershed by like emotionally arguing with each other and whoever the loudest voice is wins. Like, let's actually get some science done, and let's base our decisions on what the best science is telling us, right? And that's the common ground that we're always looking to find. So what does the best science tell us about hydrology, about fish, about all the, all the critters? Anything we can study and really put some good data behind it, it helps our collective understanding of the watershed and decision making. So I'm gonna just sort of jump a little bit in history, but then really want to open it up to questions, because just so I can see, there might be issues that you guys are concerned about here in Lolo that don't come to mind for me, so I'll keep it kind of loose like that. So stewardship of the land is critical. People recognizing the value of the role that the ranchers play in managing the water, and communicating that out to the rest of the community. So at the same time so the Watershed Committee started forming, we were in the process of being incorporated as a nonprofit when that movie came out and all of a sudden fly fishing became a thing. It was a thing, but then the boom happened, and now all of a sudden you've got this influx of fishermen and women, guides and outfitters on the river, and they're obviously have their concerns about fish. What fish are in there, how many fish are in there, endangered fish are in there. So the ranchers that initially put together the Watershed Committee immediately realized that we got to reach out to and create as broad of a stakeholder base as possible. So they invited guides and outfitters to help design and sort of steer the questions that we wanted answered. And we brought in, and we always wanted to bring in partnerships with all our agencies, right? The folks that are monitoring for fish, we need to hear directly from them. And to this day, it's pretty incredible that the hydrologist for the DNRC that does the Big Hole once a month comes down and drives down to Divide just to tell us what the climate and the weather are doing. Nothing in his job description obligates him to do that. The fisheries biologists are always like one cell phone call away for us. They come a couple times a year to present on fisheries data. We have the Butte area wildlife biologist presents on elk numbers, sheep numbers, tells us about all of the work that they're doing, monitoring the species around us. So we get, on a monthly basis, we kind of get a great dose of understanding of what all the resource managers around us are doing. No one agency is doing it all, right? It's really, and just that physical space creates a sense of common understanding about the resource that we all kind of love and depend on, right? So I think that's a really critical part of the work. So the drought management plan was one of the key things that we first developed. What that plan does is it basically says, we worked with the biologists and the hydrologists to determine what are the critical levels that we need for water in the river. Like, if we want to maintain the lowest possible amount of water in the river to maintain fisheries, a viable fishery, what is that for CFS? What are the temperature triggers for trout that we need to be really aware of? Those we got established and we put them in writing, and we developed the watershed management plan that says if we hit these flow triggers, ranchers are going to start calling each other and putting back water. If everybody does it, it works. If people hold out, you have this sense of, well, if I give back water, the guy downstream is just going to take it, right? And then I'm not helping the resource out at all, right? So we had to kind of get everybody on board. And for the most part in the Big Hole, most people that are irrigating are participating in the drought management plan. One of the key factors that helped us do that is the biggest ranchers, the guys that had been there the longest, some of the ones with the oldest water rights were the ones that first signed on. So, if there's any question of like how you get a stakeholder group together, if you get the big dogs on board early, that really helps because they're influential members of their community, right? So we got those guys were part of, guys and gals, were part of the formation of the committee. So just from that, it really helped kind of get the word out. And so when the biggest irrigator says, hey, I'm not taking half of my water right now that I could, it sort of gives nobody else an excuse, right? Nobody else really has an excuse to not do their part and give up. Right now, as we speak, this year, ranchers are taking about 50% or less of the water that they could be taking right now. Everybody's making cuts. Folks are selling their cows now. They're making dramatic changes to what they're planning on doing because they know they're not going to be able to overwinter their cattle, and hay prices are through the roof. So everyone's kind of being very conservative at this point, and nobody wants to see the river dry up like that. We've been around long enough now that folks get the impact of a dried river. So from the ranchers, it's a water volume, how much they're taking, but then you have the fishing guiding communities that are critical to our small towns, right? They drive the tourist economy and all the dollars that sustain all the little towns. We don't have a big town really near us. We've got Dillon at the further southern end, past the Big Hole. We've got Butte. Actually, 40% of the Big Hole's, 40% of Butte's drinking water is pumped out of the Big Hole River up and over the Continental Divide into Butte. So anything that we do in the Big Hole regarding water quality helps Butte out quite a bit. So drought management plan is still in effect. It's been working for 25 years. State agencies, they're still the regulatory bodies that make calls, but really like ranchers have bought into this idea that we're all gonna share in the success of the river and we're all gonna share when it's time to sacrifice, and everyone's kind of doing that. The guides and outfitters on the river these days, they all, except for a couple holdouts, decided amongst themselves that nobody's gonna fish past 2 o'clock before Fish and Wildlife, before they even put hoot owls on the river, the major guides. And I just kind of think that wouldn't have happened without a long history of folks coming together and trying to find common ground. Like that, again, that social infrastructure that I mentioned at the beginning, that the space that's there for people to come together and talk and learn from each other, I think is the only reason that would have happened. Because otherwise, without that sort of shared vision, it's everybody for themselves, right? I mean, when things get tough, like this year, it's like, well, I'm gonna make as much hay as I can. And the reality of rivers in western Montana is there's more water rights than there is water. And that's probably the case here, right? So you're dealing with a unfair, incorrect system of water rights. Playing with water rights and arguing over water rights is not, it's going to be a very painful way to go to deal with water management, right?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So we learned earlier this month that 40% of our water is actually natural loss, and not necessarily the irrigators or the residents or whatever.
So it's ET.
Yes.
Okay.
And but I want to ask, what was it that put a fire under those ranchers' butts to do something about it? Did they get a letter from the government? Was there a warning where they collectively decided we now need to do something about it?
I think it was a combination of things that didn't necessarily all happen at once, but there were letters from the DNRC saying, we're thinking the Big Hole is chronically dewatered and we're thinking about sort of attaching this label to it, which would have which folks understood very quickly, like that would have just meant more oversight and regulatory people coming into the watershed, telling them and sort of managing water for them. And then the potential listing of the grayling was a big deal. There were lawsuits sort of pending, and they understood the consequences of that. If you get a listing, the liability that you've got at that point is huge, right? And then you couple that with just physically seeing a dry riverbed, and it's just sort of like, whoa, you know, we have to have these conversations. Like, and because if we don't, it's going to be a lot more painful, and it's going to be everyone kind of on their own, dealing with their own regulatory battles with whoever, right? Because then a litigant for like a bull trout, for example, could say, you know, you took too much water. I know you're all right. You took too much water. I'm going to sue you and you. We're friends. You're okay. That's no way to manage a watershed, right? And that is what, there's no structure, there's no dependability, there's no system in place when things go that direction. So the alternative to that is some sort of collective understanding of how to manage water and what the watershed is and what the resources are, right? Yeah.
So in the time since, like, in 20 years, I'm sure that y'all have had new people moving in. How do you sort of get these, like, new ranchers, new outfitters on board?
Word of mouth is the greatest way to do that. We do a lot of times, you know, it really is word of mouth, because the local folks, they see the new landowners come in, and thankfully they're kind of the keystone ranchers, if you want to say, and every watershed's got them. They've been around the longest, they understand the dynamics of water, and a lot of times the new folks, you know, come from out of state, they come from a different regulatory environment, they come with their different ideas of what they can and can't do, and a lot of times, like, we've had the fences that a new guy comes in and buys this, like, prime piece of the lower Big Hole by Glen, this beautiful spot, and he was sort of guided in, well, you want to lease, you know, you should lease this ground, so-and-so, you know, needs some ground to graze on, could you lease to him? They kind of coach each other through it. You're always going to get some, you know, super thick-headed folks that come in and say, no, I know what I want to do, you know, it's going to be like this, and no one's going to tell me what to do. And, you know, those folks, gradually, when they show up at a committee meeting, and they start seeing what's going on, and they start seeing that, wow, everyone's kind of being nice, and we're talking, and we're understanding things, and wise elders of the community speak up and, you know, kind of share their knowledge of the area. As far as new folks, guides and outfitters, that's one of the tensions that I think still exists a lot in the Big Hole, is the older generation of guides and outfitters that saw how bad it was before, and they saw the rivers drying up. They kind of have this sense of history and what's been done since. New guides and outfitters that are feeling this kind of pain right now, you know, they're getting let go from their jobs. But the ones that stay are working, like one guy did 52 days in a row guiding, because, you know, they just had to run as few people working to run as many clients as possible. And they're just burnt out, and then it's smoky and it's hot and people are stressed. That's not the time to try to get everybody together. You want to wait till the energy's down a little bit and reflect on what's happened. But so we have to do a lot of educating of the new guides and outfitters that are out there. You know, ranchers see drought. They know drought. Their entire existence is dependent on what's happening in the skies and the timing of when the rain comes, right? So they tend to be a little bit calmer about the situation. So the more we can kind of share that experience, the more we can just not get into a position where we're making decisions or having discussions in the heat of the moment. That's never effective. Anyone in a relationship or marriage, similar parallels could be drawn, right? Now think of that in like a big family, where you're trying to bring a lot of different interests to come together. So the drought management plan, I mean, I was actually kind of blown away this year by the effectiveness of the drought management plan, because I had the regional fisheries director calling me and saying, we're 20 CFS away from a full river closure in the lower river. Should we close it now to be safe? Asking me. I have no regulatory authority, right? I'm like, who am I? Like, I don't even really, I barely understand these issues. But they wanted, the fisheries folks, they wanted to make sure that the watershed committee was on board and supportive of the decisions being made. And so, you know, my job at that point is just like my ear just like blows up. It's so hot. I'm on the phone all the time. I just try to call everyone. I'm calling the guides. I'm like, what do you guys think? They're like, shut it down. The guides and outfitters, when they're saying, I'm going to take a financial hit, but shut it down because we want the resource to be there and to bounce back next year, like that says a lot, you know? So I just try to check in as much as possible with the different stakeholders. And again, you can't call everybody, but you kind of call your key people that you know probably represent the viewpoints of most of your constituents, right? And it's hard. It's a big watershed, and I struggle with that a little bit. New ownerships. I'm always just I ask my board, you know, we have a 22-member governing board. It originally started as a technical advisory board, and then we shifted like 6 or 7 years ago to a nonprofit board. And some folks still really don't understand the difference, and that they're actually directors now, and you know, they got to help us out, like raising funds and things like that. But it's, you know, old habits are hard to change. But they do. You know, we count on each of them to sort of do their own little outreach, and I ask them for the latest, you know, whose property's selling. Like they tell me when new properties sell, and they tell me when, oh, there's so-and-so, he's a new person, I'm gonna go talk to him. It's like, hey, make sure they know about the watershed committee, bring them to the next meeting, right? It's slow and steady, but it's, you know, I think you guys here in the Lolo, it's like much smaller watershed. Like the Big Hole is 1.7 million acres. The river is 162 miles. It starts high alpine, super snowy, to, you know, high desert by the time it's running out. So very different climatic regimes. This little corner right here of down around Twin Bridges is one of the driest places in the entire state. It's like 9 inches of rain per year, tops. So it's really tricky. Last thing I'll say, just kind of about the evolution of the organization, we always did, the major work that was done at first was all about understanding how much water ranchers were taking, and anything that they were taking that, even though they were flood irrigating, we realized that actually you could open your head gates less and still get the exact same production and leave more in the river. And so some really good hydrologists that were focused on that issue helped us do that. And so we realized those old school pin and planks, a lot of irrigators, it's not because they wanted to take all that water, it's that they physically, their infrastructure just wouldn't allow them to like screw their head gates shut. It's just old stuff. So we funded a lot of head gate improvements and ditch improvements. And wow, I'd much rather take water from this cold water tributary than pull it from the main stem. So anywhere where we could do those types of shifts, we funded a lot of that in the early years of the organization. We're looking now to do a lot more of that in the lower part of the river where we haven't done as much of that work. And the biggest change for us since 2016, I, as a contractor, came with a project idea to the committee, and they took it on and they put together a grant through the DQ, the 319 program. And so that started our engagement and my work in the Big Hole. And after several years of that, and we had another set of projects lined up, they just said, you got to just come do this in-house. So I ran the restoration programs for the Big Hole for several years and moved into the ED position in 2019. But I really brought my interest in restoration and our ability to kind of get these projects done and manage them and hire hire contractors, oversee them. The fact that we had in-house expertise, and I think a lot of the groups, you guys have this now. A lot of the watershed groups around are heading in that direction, and the biggest advantage of that is you can get a project from a concept to just from an idea to a conceptual plan without having to hire super expensive engineers, typically. So if you can get to that phase where you actually have a concept that you can propose the big money for to actually get it done without having to spend 50 grand up front, that's huge, right? And I think that's a big difference. And a lot of groups are doing this now, and obviously, Clark Fork Coalition and TU, they're full of folks that are really good at doing that, which makes it a lot more competitive to get the money. But some of the things from my perspective, just some of the things that I really focus on the restoration side of things is two things. I am trying to mimic flood irrigators and beaver. Because when you think about water and availability of water, and that whole thing about flood irrigation soaking the soils, right? That's what flood irrigators have basically replaced the beavers on the landscape, because the beavers used to back all that water up. First thing the settlers did when they got to these places, they're like, this is gross, this is mucky, I can't run my cattle in this, let's get these beaver out of here, right? And let's kick the stream as far over to the side that'll give me as much pasture and as much hay ground as possible. That shift happened across Montana and across the West, just broadly speaking. So I always come with the frame of there used to be a lot more beaver everywhere. Our streams were not single-threaded, beautiful little cottonwood line channels. They were messy. You never knew how many channels they were going to have in any given year, and that's okay. That's actually better for wildlife. It's more biodiversity, and it's more natural water storage in your watershed. We tried on the question of natural water storage. We tried for years, and there's still people to this day that says what we need is a reservoir. We need to just build a dam somewhere in our watershed, and we'll never have to worry about water supply. And we tried. I mean, we had a couple projects. We sent ranchers to DC to try to hustle up money. It's $40 million for a watershed that has 2,000 people in it. Just no one's buying that, right? So, and the days of maybe trying to get some big mega infrastructure in a watershed, I don't know if that's very viable alternative.
Not in this watershed.
Right.
The hydrologist that spoke to us said we couldn't do reservoirs, we couldn't put a dam in.
Okay.
Really, the only way to conserve water is to have more groundwater storage upstream.
Yeah.
And so the first restoration project we're going to do covers only, groundwater retention.
Yep.
But it's the first project on a rancher's property
Yep.
that we will have done,
Yep.
and hope that we can mimic that project elsewhere.
Yep.
But some of you were there. That seemed like the one of the solutions that was actually viable for putting water back in Lolo.
Absolutely. I'm not being rude by looking at my phone. I'm trying to pull up a text message from one of my ranchers. Hey guys, I was just reading the newsletter about your work on riparian areas. You should come take a look at our creek. It's barely running, but the green areas are very green and spread out. This is a lady who had no clue about beaver mimicry, about water storage, about any of this. She saw some pictures of what we were doing on Forest Service above her place. I just came to ask for permission to walk upstream. And she just saw the pictures and was like, oh, wow. And now she's getting the benefits, but her initial thing was, so if you build up the base of the stream and the water pours out, then I can cross this creek easier on my horse. And I don't have to go all the way around. I was like, yep. She's like, let's do this. that was the entry point for hers. I don't care what the entry point is, right? Let's do the work. But now she's seeing, even on a low water year like this, she's got greener grass much further out from the channel than she used to have, which obviously translates into better forage for her cattle and a better yield on her business, right? So folks are starting to kind of get it, because there also is a lot of hesitation with beaver in managing and working lands. They are a pain in the butt. They go to the wrong places. They block up culverts. There's a lot that they do, but there's a lot of tools that are available to mitigate for those damages. In my estimation, if we can do people acting like beaver, eventually if the habitat's right, the beaver will come in if it's the right spot. And then you've got free workers. You've got you've got free labor. We've had some funny experiences, some hydrologists actually with trackers in a beaver pond, and they showed a beaver pond, bust at like 3 in the morning, and the hydrograph just goes, right? All the water is leaving, and then at 4:34 in the morning, the water comes right back up because the beaver came in and plugged the leak in the dam, and then I made a lot of jokes about which one of you engineers would come out here at 4 in the morning to fix a busted beaver dam. But anyway, so we really kind of just, that's my lens. If water availability is key to saving our fishery, and if we can't have a dam, it's like, how best can we make the most use of the water when it is abundant? Because it is here. It is. You guys have a snowy watershed at the top. There's a lot of moisture coming down. The trick is, how late can you extend that moisture into the dry season? And how much can you hold it into the soil as much as possible? The other thing that is the major, maybe, opportunity that we're struggling with, but when I hired my replacement, when I became an ED, I was very focused on forestry, because the other place where all your water is in these trees. And fire suppression and a lot of fire management in the past has made it so that our forests are overstocked, and there's way more straws in the ground sucking up that water than there could be. Some of the ranchers, one guy told me an anecdote of when the pine beetle came in and wiped out 50% of my forest, all of a sudden springs that I had never seen all of a sudden started popping 7 years later. Because the pine beetle came in, 7 years later is when you have like a big die-off of the pine trees, and all of a sudden there's water where there wasn't water, right? Because the pine trees aren't sucking them all up, and it's evapotranspired and it's gone. So from our standpoint, that's kind of where we're focused. We've had a lot of success. That's kind of where this guy is, and I'll be happy to either come up or I can pass these around or whatever. But this is all from the Mount Hagen Wildlife Management Area. It's one sub-basin where we've put a lot of emphasis and a lot of work. It's the one that brought me into the Big Hole area. And we've really, because it's state ground, we've got great partnerships. We've been able to do a lot of projects up there that demonstrate what happens to a landscape and what you can do on a landscape when you start taking incised, really degraded channels that never overtop their banks and all of a sudden transform them into wet messes, for lack of a better term, right? So we've done that. When we get into really degraded situations like placer mines and things like that, that thought process of flood it out, pretend like you're a beaver, changed how we are designing our project. So instead of going into a stream, be like, oh, we can engineer a little turn here and a little, thing, and we can kind of scoot around the edges. And so I did one project on Oregon Creek where we had an engineer come in and design a really Rosgen perfect stream. Rosgen sort of a classification method for streams, and there's a whole methodology to make very perfect channels. If you ever go up to the Deer Creek overlook on the Clark Fork at the confluence of the Blackfoot and you look upstream, that is a perfect Rosgen channel. I hate it. I don't hate it. They did a great job. But you can see just how really perfectly symmetrical design that was. And to me, that's not the way that system was, right? It was way messier. And they did their best, and I'm not knocking. It was a phenomenal piece of work. But so taking that kind of highly engineered approach, I actually said, you know what? This whole floodplain is so messed up. If we get a little it's not, what are we getting out of that, right? Just making a little bit of a better situation. I said, take a bulldozer, start at one end, just flatten it, start again, and build in your meander how you want, but really build in floodplain retention. Like build in a big wide floodplain that can just absorb all of that water when it comes in hot in the spring. So we've been doing a lot of that kind of thing. You know, Heather can be able to steer what you're doing to the right grant source, but basically you can do the same thing and call it 5 or 6 different benefits depending on who's got the money, right? It actually, that part of it is actually kind of simple. You can get away with a lot that way. So natural water storage has been a real focus of ours, and then we're in the process now of rewriting our watershed restoration plans, and what we're landing on is subdividing our watershed into its 14 sub-watersheds, and just kind of honing in on the impairments that we know, and starting to kind of map out where we can do projects to achieve the recommended reductions of sediment or whatever. What I want to do is just get a couple steps ahead of the funding agencies and the grant opportunities by already having a desired end goal. Like, if you have, let's say, 100% too much sediment running through your stream, you can figure out, well, that's about, if we improved 2 miles of channel and turned it from, 100% erosion to 50% erosion across 2 miles of channel, we would actually hit that mark. And so we want to kind of get that objective out in front. And then when the money comes by and the grant opportunities come by, and you're like, oh, that fits with this project right here. It's already kind of set up. And as a group and as a director, it's just trying to get off of the money hamster wheel. I was with someone last weekend that was like, get the cheese, get the cheese, get the cheese, get the cheese. It's kind of what it feels like as a director. You're just constantly like trying to follow the money, and I really want to be more systematic about actually bring the money to us, to this really tightly developed plan that's going to achieve all the objectives that we want. It's kind of where we're trying to head, and thankfully I've got great staff so I can dedicate some of my time to trying to thinking that through. And there's a million other things we could talk about, but maybe that gives you a sense of what all we're doing, and I'm totally happy and psyched to talk more based on your questions.
I have one question. I guess it's backtracking a little bit.
Yeah.
But how do the water right holders maintain their rights when they're taking like less than 50% of what they could be? Like what, less than 50% of what it says on their volume?
Boy, that's a fabulous question. From the like use it or lose it type of. Well, if it isn't there, you can't use it.
Okay, yeah.
I think,
Yeah, but the senior water right holders who could be taking it but aren't.
Right. I think there's something about that it would have to be kind of a chronic situation where all of a sudden you're not using the water for many years in a row, and then that could really be seen as a, not using it, so you have to lose it. Like, there's been a sort of de facto change of use.
Yeah.
Right? And that's how it would be seen, because it's not, someone would have to know that that's happening and report it. And also, we're still, not all the water rights are adjudicated in the Big Hole. It's still kind of in limbo. So there are very few ditch riders running around actually counting and measuring. And that's something that we do need to put as many measuring devices on ditches as landowners will allow you to have is a big deal, because that's really going to help you understand where the water is going. It's also very, very sensitive. I mean, how much water a rancher's taken is their secret sauce. I mean, it's like, ask Coca-Cola what's in the, what makes it taste like that. Like, it's sort of a black box, but in the spirit of kind of cooperation, I think there's ways that you can get at that without kind of trying to get too into people's business. It's kind of how I see it. That's a good question. Yeah, I don't know exactly. Like I said, I really try to stay out of water rights because you could really get sucked into some dangerous territory. I mean, it's more so it's really just a cooperation. And now with this water year and all the stress, we're working kind of at the state level to figure out like what kind of incentives can we put out there to help folks. We had a landowner that I didn't cover at all the grayling program that's up in the upper watershed, and it's a fabulous partnership, really the same model that we have of partnerships and collaborative. There's actually specific conservation plans that all the ranchers up there have. They've already committed to giving up to a certain amount of their water. So that's kind of in writing. And the reason for that program is enrolled landowners in the CCAA, if the grayling were to be listed, they would actually be protected from they would be protected legally from getting sued because they did do voluntary conservation, because they participated, and it's just like well documented that they were like an active part of trying to save the fish. They get some protections legally if the fish does get listed. We did have one rancher not participating in the CCAA that lots of folks were kind of looking, and the river was down to 3 CFS, and he said, I'll put 30 in there, but you got to give me $50,000. It's brutal, right? And I mean, there was some serious thought had to go into like, do you go down that road? We ended up not doing it. It's kind of it's kind of like taking a river hostage, but from his perspective, he said, well, all these CCAA enrollees got a lot of money and they got their incentives in the form of all these projects and all this investment on their ground. I don't get anything, so why am I gonna just sacrifice my livelihood and my ability to grow hay, and no one's gonna give me anything for it, right? So it can get really tricky, but I think if there were a incentive or a pot of money that was equally available to all landowners and anybody could apply to it, and you can figure out, that's kind of what some people are starting to talk about, and have an ability to lease water kind of on an emergency basis for people and compensate them for hay. It's really not we're kind of not in an easy situation because of the amount of water rights that are allocated versus the amount of water that's actually available. It doesn't balance, it doesn't pencil. So I try to keep my focus on the resource and how can we improve the resource to provide as much water for us as possible. So forest thinning, forest management, beaver mimicry type work, floodplain restoration, getting stock water wells for ranchers so that they can don't have to pull directly from the river, identifying your cold water inputs and making sure those stay cold, getting vegetation, shading your stream. So that we learned a lot from studies that basically the radiation and the UV hitting the water, and that really heats it up. So the more you can shade, the better. Even though the willows take up water, the net benefit of having that shade is key. Yeah.
So sort of summer's getting longer, summer's getting hotter, and rain season getting shorter. Are there any things that y'all used to do at the start that sort of aren't proving effective anymore, or some things that y'all didn't do as much that now you're sort of trying to implement more because they have greater effects?
That's a great question. Trying to think of any projects that we did that were kind of flops or duds. The only thing I can think of that comes to mind is we did invest and tried a lot to do our own monitoring, try to get like sense of like soil moisture or in-stream flows and measure, okay, how much flow is in this stream today, and how about this one and that one, and let's put in these water measuring devices. It's really expensive to keep that up and to create a great data set. So like we had equipment failures with the soil probes, and like ranchers tried, and then lots of goodwill, but at the end of the day, like the equipment doesn't work as well, the data you didn't have controls set up, and so the data is just kind of ends up not really being very useful. So I think there is a risk of you kind of spinning your wheels trying to do too much research to try to find out everything you can. At the end of the day, it's ecology, and a lot of times, like, a picture says 1,000 words. We were talking about drones, and one of the things that's really, to the other part of your question, what has changed is our focus on restoration projects that in the past seemed kind of, oh, there's no way we can fix that. That's 3 miles of channel. It's been placer mined for 100 years. Like, we're never going to fix that, right? That's too big. Actually, we brought together 9 funding sources, and it took us 5 years, but we pulled off a $1.2 million project that fixed an entire stream system, right? And it's just the partnerships and having somebody, Heather, like, that's the job, right? The watershed groups, I think our job is, I call us, we're kind of the glue, right? There's funders out there, there's experts in fish, there's experts in water, there's contractors, there's engineers. We're the stuff that just glues it all together to take an idea and make it a project, and we kind of walk the project through all the way. We're the only ones there from the beginning all the way to the end, and we're the ones that have the investment in tracking the results and reporting them out. And so we'll do things like the drone flights, but before after photos, make sure that you're doing those really well. Taking fewer, better photos is highly preferred to taking all the photos. I've learned.
Not remembering where you took the photos 3 years later.
Right, yeah. I could look at photos I took 10 years ago, and I know exactly where that is, but it's totally useless.
Yeah.
So things like that. I think the focus on the active, I think what the ranchers, I remember them saying when I first started talking about the techniques and what we're doing when we see really incised gullies that are just moving sediment, cut down trees and put the trees in the gully, like just stop that sediment from flowing down, and grab rocks and build little dams where you can, and all things that intuitively just kind of make sense. If you've ever been 12 and saw water moving and stuck things in a creek to see what happened, you're qualified to do this work. And the ranchers kind of got that. They were like, I love how you're just using what you have. It's almost just, you're kind of just rearranging all the carbon on your landscape in a way that's more effective for you, right?
I think there's I don't know if it's happening in the Big Hole, but the philosophy of like really active, invasive restoration projects versus more passive.
Absolutely.
Where you, instead of like creating every single bend and direction the river's gonna go, you actually just grade areas to allow the river to find its way.
Yeah.
And it'll be a more natural channel in the end because the river created.
That's happening. Yeah, absolutely. It's a big shift. Just even in my short professional career, I've seen a big shift from that sort of highly thought out, engineered approach to fixing things, and more where you can do it, where it's safe, where there's nothing that could get damaged downstream, letting natural process, basically just giving as much as you need to give for natural processes to jumpstart themselves is I think is the direction.
And it's cheaper.
And it's way cheaper. Oh yeah, so yeah, going back to that Oregon Creek when we did the dozer thing, instead of the highly engineered channel, I saved $400,000 on that project from engineering costs. The guy had also like blown out his estimate of what it costs per mile to like get an excavator in and jiggle it around and build a little thing, but it's night and day. If you can take kind of a really intense approach, but it's one approach, one time, and if you build in the floodplain retention, so when the water spills over, it's not going to carve a new channel. If you build some of that, those safeties into your project, it's super inexpensive. We did that one Oregon Creek project. This is it before, right? So this is a big placer pile. That's the channel. It's never getting out of there. It was about 1,000 feet of channel that we ended up doing. It cost $100 a linear foot at the end of the day to do that work. And it's just a couple machines on the ground, and they did it in like 3 weeks or something. What else you guys got?